This next lecture is about Auguste Rodin, and he's not the monster on the right-hand side who fought Mothra and Ghidorah and Godzilla, but he is a little bit of a monster in some ways, and you'll find out about that from his biography and also how he treated some of his girlfriends and things like that. So it's kind of an interesting story to talk about him. So Rodin is a French sculptor who was born basically into the middle classes. Maybe he was a little bit poor. His father was a policeman. And when he was a kid, he basically got into art school. And as he grew up, he met his lifetime companion, a woman named Rose Bureau. If I mispronounce French words, please forgive me. My French is very dreadful. And he lives with this woman, Rose, for most of his life, but doesn't marry her until a few weeks before she dies in 1917. And in fact, he had, I think, a 10 to 15-year love affair with a sculptress named Camille Claudel. He began working in a studio of a pretty famous sculptor in 1864, a guy by the name of A.E. Carrier-Belleau. And he submitted work to the salon and it was rejected. He didn't do as well as he wanted to, but then he really starts to work, and at the age of 35, he actually took a trip in 1875 to Italy. So after he goes to Italy, it has a strong influence on him, and the rest of his work really reflects his attention to the classics, to the work he saw in Italy, and also to some things in France in the 19th century. So I'm going to try to give you a little bit of background first to understand why his work developed the way it did. First off, I think that in the 19th century, everything's going to begin with an artist, a writer that we studied much earlier when we were studying Florence, by the name of Dante. And also with the study of Michelangelo and with the study of ancient Greek and Roman sculpture fragments, as well as stuff made during the Renaissance by especially Michelangelo would have a big influence on the sculptures of that time period. And although this sculptor, Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux, was not actually Rodin's teacher, he was an important character in terms of Rodin's development, and he also exhibits some things that I think are very important to French painting and French literature and French studies during the 19th century, specifically at the end of the 1700s and into the early 19th century. And what I'm talking about is there was a man by the name of Dante who wrote the Divine Comedy just before 1300, in the late 1200s. And in the 19th century in France, there was this sort of renaissance, a rebirth of studying Dante and studying the stories from Dante. So one of the things that became very important to the French and to the study of classics was to read Dante as a way of looking back. And the scene we see here in front of us looks back at one of the episodes out of Dante's Divine Comedy in Canto 33 of the Inferno. And there is this Pisan count who was actually hired by the Florentines to kind of come in and make peace. And he comes in and there's these problems between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines and all kinds of bad things that happen. And so what happens, this guy, Ugolino, is actually sealed up into a tower. And when he's sealed into the tower, he actually ends up having to eat his children to survive in the tower. And of course, they all die. Now, it's not like he's a villain, but when Dante encounters him on his trip through Purgatory and the Inferno, he describes Ugolino gnawing on the head of Ruggiero, who was basically his rival. And one of the stanzas that the is in there in the Divine Comedy goes like this. But when to our somber cell was thrown a slender ray, and each face was lit, I saw in each the aspect of my own. For every grief, both of my hands I bit, and suddenly from the floor rising, they, thinking my hunger was the cause of it, exclaimed, Father, eat thou of us, and stay our suffering. Thou didst our being dress in this sad flesh, now strip it all away. So it's kind of a creepy little episode in the Divine Comedy. And if you look closely at the sculpture, you can see that it's kind of a grotesque thing that's modeled quite a bit on Michelangelo, modeled a little bit on the Laocoon group, and really is going to have a strong influence on how Rodin works as a sculptor. So just to refresh your memory, one of the things that I think is significant or really important, and will come up again later on in this lecture, is that Dante was a Florentine who was one of the first poets ever to write in the common vernacular language of Italian. And he wrote basically our vision of what heaven, hell, and purgatory are like. There's no other description like this in all of Western literature until Dante comes along. And a lot of people actually who are Christian or Catholic or a sect thereof often misinterpret Dante's interpretation of these levels of heaven and hell and purgatory as being straight out of the Bible, and they're actually not. He's kind of the inventor of this. And in the 19th century, because he was such a famous writer and there was this sort of classical education that people got, alongside of a romantic education in the movements of romanticism that had happened just before, I think Dante was really studied quite a bit. And we're going to see his influence on how the work works and how Florentine sculpture from the Renaissance probably had a strong influence on Rodin and other sculptors. We'll start first with one of Rodin's first sculptures that was exhibited in the Salon, and it was a pretty important sculpture for his career. In 1877, when he was 36, he basically had made this sculpture and exhibited it. Originally, it was actually called The Vanquished and was supposed to be a sort of reference to the idea that war vanquishes people. I think it might make reference to the Franco-Prussian War as well and some of the things that happened there. And when he exhibited it, there was an uproar about the work. And what the uproar was that they said that he did body casting and that it was produced by a French term moulage, which is just body casting. And he got into sort of debates with people. And according to one of the museum guides at the Cantor Center, the story goes something like this. He exhibited this sculpture and he brought the soldier who it was actually a depiction of and photographs of this soldier named Auguste Nate, who was a Belgian soldier. And he sort of disproved to everybody that it was a body casting. Even, I think, at some points had the soldier pose naked with it. So at that point, I think what happened with him was he realized that if he was working too much in a Renaissance mode, and you can see this almost kind of looks like a sculpture, for instance, by Praxiteles. It also has a bit in common with the Doryphorus, with the contrapposto stance. It looks a little bit like some late Hellenistic sculpture. I think he realized that he needed to do some things that might be a little bit different in his sculpture to be a little bit more contemporary, and also so that he wouldn't be accused of having too much facility. It's kind of an interesting idea because I think in a lot of art schools, sometimes a student will have so much facility, they'll be able to draw and paint and sculpt so realistically and well that they will be accused of being too technically good and not spiritual enough or not concept enough. And so I think what he did was he made a sort of paradigm shift in his work. The first paradigm shift that we see, at least in the work that I'm showing you, has to do with this sculpture of St. John the Baptist preaching. And again, when I went to the Legion of Honor in San Francisco, there was a tour guide who was taking me on a trip through the Rodins, and she told me this story that basically When this sculpture was exhibited, it was supposed to be St. John the Baptist, the wild man who always wears the feathers and stuff, and the furs, and who was the cousin of Jesus, preaching in the wilderness, and that's why he was depicted as sort of gnarled and sort of tough looking and very muscular. And one of the things that they said was, the critics sort of busted on him about it and said, well, is he standing? Is he walking? Is he a walking preacher? Because if he's standing like that, it's a really weird stance because it's not actually contrapposto. It's this weird sort of step forward. What is he doing with his arms? And what Rodin was trying to do, I believe, with this sculpture is really give a sort of rough feeling that's kind of almost late Hellenistic in nature, but also this idea of a romantic gesture. And one of the ways that I was taught about Rodin to sort of hack or figure out his style, I have the style of Impressionist for Rodin because he's working contemporaneously with the young Impressionists. But if you look at the work, it really is sort of Impressionist because the surface is very rough, the body is very gestural. The roughness of the bronze and the surface texture of it catches the light in sort of facets and deep hollows. And that could be considered kind of, in a way, impressionist use of light, even though it really deals more with chiaroscuro and shading. Now, the other thing that's kind of impressionistic, if you think about it, is he gives you the impression of movement, and he also does some exaggerated things. Noses are big, the hollows of the eyes are extra deep, and sometimes things in Rodin's sculpture like feet and hands are over-exaggerated and super large. The tour guide went on to explain to me that, interestingly enough, he had a reaction to this. And later in his career, like 20 years after, and this is something that's really important in the work of Rodin, is he tends to recycle and reuse. It's almost like a schema and correction on his own work. And what he did was he took that same figure in the same stance and he sort of lopped the arms and the head off of it and roughed it up a little bit more and did a rougher casting of it, which is, if you think about it, in the 1900s, that's the beginning of modernism. 1907, 1917, that's the peak time that Picasso is working. So he is sort of reducing and abstracting the sculpture, and probably some of the things that give him permission for this are antique sculpture fragments, but he claimed that he was trying to give the absolute essence of the sculpture to the viewer, and he was boiling it down to its abstract essence. The next sculpture or set of sculptures we're going to study sort of tie in all of those things that we're talking about, a romantic point of view, a historical point of view having to do with the 100 Years' War, also some ideas having to do with gesture, with exaggeration, and almost like a late Hellenistic dramatic feeling about things. And so I think probably the first place to start would be the context and the story of this sculpture, and then we'll explain what happened when he was commissioned to make it and that kind of thing. The sculpture commemorates an event in which, during the 100 Years' War, around 1347, Edward III of England basically attacked the city of Calais. And because they were in so much trouble and they were hungry, they were starving, they needed to find a way out of the situation. So they basically asked for a surrender, and the surrender came in the form of Edward allowing them to pick 6 of the town burgermeisters, which are basically the leaders of the town or the mayors, and they needed to show up in sackcloth, holding their own ropes, and they would go to their own death. Well, the story magically at the end of it is that these guys walked, to the king to become executed, and the king was so impressed and the queen were so impressed that there was leniency and they let them live. And so in the 1800s, the town of Calais commissioned Rodin to make a sculpture that would commemorate this event. Now, the first sort of ideas on the left-hand side, you see the completed version, and it's one of the versions. And I guess I should mention that you'll see multiple copies of Rodin sculptures all over the place. There's probably, 10 to 15 versions of every sculpture he has in different sizes, shapes, and forms. So every museum you go to, you'll see one. The thing on the right-hand side is called a maquette. It's just a small scale, probably about 3 feet tall, what he had first envisioned and was trying to think through. The one on the left is actually the thing that he completed. So his idea was to show them with their very human gestures, their feelings, but also his first idea was to put them on a pedestal in a traditional way. And he really didn't dig this. It just wasn't working for him. So what he decided was these are the citizens of Calais who are sort of egalitarian in a way. And so what he thought he would do is he'd put them at ground level so that you could actually walk through them. And so depending on where you go, if you go to Stanford's campus, they have got a really nice little grouping of them that are just a little bit bigger than life size, and you can walk through the collection. And some of the things that you'll see when you actually go visit it is the size of the hands and the feet and things like that are really exaggerated, even the hollows in the cheeks and stuff. So he brings the sculpture down to ground level and makes it so that you can actually interact with each one of these people. And each one is supposed to be a clearly identified figure. You can do a little bit more research on that if you want. And he's trying to show you the dignity and the pathos of what these people were experiencing. The twisted forms and the exaggeration of the hands and the anatomy are all meant to communicate power that's restrained in a way. And I think that's a big theme somewhat in Rodin's work, is that he has this overpowering anatomy that shows this extreme muscular power that's a little bit like Michelangelo, but much more taut and much more gaunt. And he is really adept at figuring out how to create hollows and make the sculpture rough enough so that it looks like a sort of gnarled, rough painting in light, but with bronze. So this sculpture ultimately was accepted and was used. If you go to Stanford, you'll actually be able to see a version of this one as well. And this is from the end of his career. I think multiple castings of it were made actually after he died. Originally, it was meant to be a sculpture that was for the gates of a museum. I think it was supposed to be the d'Orsay, but check your facts on that. And he started it, and then he lost the commission for whatever reasons. And he continued to work on this thing. And one of the tour guides at the Cantor Center for the Arts explained that he basically had this sculpture in his backyard for years. And he worked on this sculpture and kept doing things to it and changing things and messing with it in such a way that it became almost this overblown thing that could never be opened up as a series of doors. And it's referred to as the gates of hell. So let's kind of study it a little bit first and see some of the precedents that Rodin was working with. First of all, remember I mentioned that Rodin had gone to Italy, and he probably, while he was in Italy, most certainly knew of Lorenzo Ghiberti's Gates of Paradise. And remember that Michelangelo had coined the phrase, the Gates of Paradise, for the doors to Florence's baptistry. And it was a series of bronze panels that depicted basically Old Testament stories, and there's quite an arrangement and a program to how you're supposed to think about these panels, and there's quite an in-depth way of even looking at the illusionism of it. So if you get a chance, go back and watch that video so that you understand a little bit more about that. So in a way, because in the 19th century, Rodin is almost like an anti-Renaissance artist, he's building on those traditions, but he's doing a sort of schema and change. He takes the idea of the gates of paradise, and instead he makes the gates of hell, which are again based on the author Dante. Let's start by looking at the sculpture in situ, and then we'll get into Dante and talk a little bit about him first. First of all, this is a photograph from Stanford's campus, and flanking on the left and the right-hand sides of the gates are these two figures. On the right-hand side is a sculpture of Eve. It has an interesting little story. If you get a chance, go take a look at it. Basically, the model who was modeling for Rodin became pregnant and couldn't model anymore, and Rodin wasn't able to finish it, but he liked the rough surface of it so much that he left it rough. But also take a look at how he's almost referring back to Giotto and Giotto's, or actually, excuse me, not Giotto, Masaccio's expulsion fresco, where Eve is ashamed and she is responsible for original sin, more or less. On the left-hand side is a sculpture we're going to see reincarnated many times throughout Rodin's work, and the sculpture is of Adam. And Adam is, notice how big those feet and hands are, that there is sort of an exaggeration of Adam in this sort of languid pose. And the right arm of Adam on our left-hand side is a finger that's pointing. That's a reference to Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, Adam receiving the spark of life. So the rest of the sculpture is sort of, I want you to think of it almost as a Photoshop collage of a lot of different things that Rodin did himself and that he recycled a lot of his own imagery. At the very top of the Gates of Hell is a sculpture of the Thinker. And the Thinker is, he did this as a large-scale sculpture. You'll see it like the Cleveland Museum has one that's actually kind of blown up. Some terrorists did something to it back in the 60s or 70s. And Ford's Art Museum has one. Lots of museums have a version of this. The Legion of Honor has one in the courtyard. And who this is someone who's thinking really hard. And it's also a reference to Dante, and I'll get into that in a second. But let's look at it sort of from formal analysis and then sort of go into it in terms of its symbology or what it means. You have this figure whose toes are curled against the rock. He is holding his stomach up and in. It's a very tight pose. His arm is almost unnatural in how hard he's leaning on his right arm. And in fact, his right arm is not on his right leg, it's on his left knee. So there's this sort of twisting seated thing with all this muscular tension and this power. And it's a guy sort of thinking really, really hard. And the explanation of this, if you look a little bit closer at it, is that the face is a reference and the hat is a reference to Dante, sort of the first creator in some ways as the divine artist creator. I want you to first take a look at this hat that Dante is wearing from this Renaissance painting, and also take a look at the face, because in the Renaissance, they actually kind of knew what Dante looked like, especially afterwards, because there were death masks made and lots of portraits of him. So the face that we see here on the far right-hand side is supposedly, I don't know if this, there's some question about this, but it's kind of fun to think it is, that is the death mask. They actually, when Dante died, they put some plaster over his face and made a mold. The center image is actually a sculpture that's from the 19th century. It's a small maquette that was supposed to be in the courtyard of a school in which Dante was studied extensively. On the left-hand side is a close-up portrait of Rodin's Thinker, and you can see that even the sort of hair looks a little bit like that cap that Dante was wearing, but it's sort of melted. And the face and the cragginess of the face is a reference to Dante as well. So let's take a look at the doors a little bit more in depth and see where this sculpture shows up. First of all, at the top of the gates, you can see that there are 3 sculptures that are just reproductions of the Adam sculpture we looked at just before. He's missing his hands, and he's reproduced 3 times. There are various interpretations of this, but the idea is basically that these are the 3 shades or the 3 fates, and that history and things have not been written yet, and that's why they don't have hands, because things are constantly being written. As you move down below those 3 figures on the lintel of the door, the top in the cornice, you'll see that there's the figure of the Thinker, who's sort of seated almost in some ways very close to scenes of the Last Judgment that we've seen, for instance, Gisli Berdis's, and also Michelangelo's for certain, that in some ways he's replacing Dante, the artist creator, with God, the creator. He's sort of substituting them because this is more of a literary reference and it's the gates of hell. Maybe he's even making a social statement about the kinds of hell we make for ourselves. And so you move down and you see sort of all of these figures that are writhing and moving about, and they seem to be in pain and some sort of agony. There are figures that are defying the lintels and doors. They're all in a lot of movement. And as we move down the sculpture, the doorway itself, you can see that the doors are actually non-functional. They really don't do anything that we can use. And if you zoom in a little bit closer on some things, there are other references to Dante and to stories from Dante. So one of the first things that we'll kind of zoom in on are the sculpture of Francesca and Paolo, which show up in two different places on this. On the left-hand side, there are two sculptures that we've made reference to. On the top, we see a sculpture of Ugolino and his children, and we'll return to that in a second. Just below that is a sculpture of Francesca and Paolo. And we'll sort of describe what's going on there in a second. On the far right-hand side, in a sort of bas-relief, is also a depiction of Francesca and Paolo, and those are all episodes out of Dante's Divine Comedy, and I believe that they have to do with purgatory. So let's tell the story first of Francesca and Paolo. Francesca was married to Paolo's brother, and they were extremely attracted to each other. And one day they were sitting around and reading Boccaccio's Decameron, and apparently they were reading, in Italian it goes per diletto, which just basically means for pleasure. They were just picking up the sort of dirtier parts of the book. And so Francesca and Paolo are sitting there, they're getting kind of excited by this passage out of Boccaccio, and they turn to each other, and just as they're about to kiss, they end up being caught by Paolo's brother, and he comes in and kills them both. When Dante encounters them in purgatory, one of the things that happens as he's encountering them in purgatory is that they are flying around in the sky. And Dante, they're moaning and complaining that look at the fate that we have in purgatory, and their particular brand of terrible stuff is that they can't actually get within an arm's length of each other. They can't actually touch each other. They also kind of can't look at each other. They're sort of back to back, but they're buffeted around by these winds. So, and when they try to get away from each other, they can't move any further away than a couple of arm's lengths. So they're stuck together forever, out of control, flying in the sky, and sort of tortured by that. And so what the sculpture on the left-hand side commemorates or shows is actually them flying through the sky, and it's them not being able to get away from each other. The sculpture on the right-hand side, which is also reproduced in various bronzes that he's done, and you'll probably know the title as The Kiss, they're not actually, it's the moment just before the kiss and just before they are both killed by the brother-in-law. Now, the other scene that we're looking at is Ugolino and his sons. And when we look at Ugolino and his sons, I already read you the passage of how they suffered. He is basically in this sort of hell, and Rodin is showing you what it must feel like to be in that kind of torture. And interestingly enough, it's not showing Ugolino gnawing on the head of Ruggiero. It shows how he got into hell, into one of the circles of hell. One of the interesting components, I think, to this sculpture is also that if you look at the molding on the doors on the left and the right-hand side, you'll notice that there are some things that are going on with that, and in particular, that the molding has been cut away. And apparently, Rodin had this sitting in his studio backyard, more or less, and he realized that the light of the molding was hanging over the sculptures and was actually blocking and putting some things in shadow, and so that you couldn't see the shift of light and shadow. You can see a lot of the important sorts of elements that he wanted to see. So he actually, when he made this originally out of clay, so he cut back some of the molding and got rid of some of the molding. As we go near the top of the thing, you can kind of see in particular where the molding has been cut away. So, in essence, what Rodin is trying to do is, I guess, like the hooks that I want you to know about this work and his sculpture in general. First of all, he does a sort of romantic, over exaggerated figures. The anatomy is over exaggerated to also express emotion, and so are poses. In some ways, it's very close to late Hellenistic sculpture. He also works with the texture quite a bit, with a rough texture, and understands that light will hit this, and that he is working with the facets of the material itself to try to create more drama through manipulating how light and shadow will play across it. And then the last thing that I think he's working with is sort of universal themes that he found an awful lot in, for instance, in Dante and in classical literature.